Cheers, my friends. Today we are going to be talking about designing and fabricating templates for slab built cups. Cups are one of my favorite objects to make, one of my favorite objects to move, and probably the only object that I genuinely collect. I just love how accessible they are, how specialized they can be, and how they can just be these great, almost kind of gestural pieces where every piece is unique. And it's really about that personal relationship between the user and that artist. So to kick things off, we're just going to talk about like what it means to make a slab cup. So using slabs, that's rolling out flat sheets of clay. And one of the tricks within that is we want to create a design that makes sense for using slabs, right? You don't want to start designing forms that are much better made on the wheel. We want to emphasize the process that we're using and take advantage of that process. This is a pretty simple one for me, and it has a couple of benefits that I love about it. For one, I kind of like to work these American flag-esque motifs, and it's way easier to do this when it's a flat form. My interiors on the bottoms tend to put stars on them, right? Those stars, I'm essentially able just to stamp them or stencil them on. Again, when I'm fabricating it, which would be pretty tricky for me to actually go in and hand paint. Let's talk about things that slabs are not the best at, right? They're not the best at making curves. You can take slabs and stretch them and modify them and pretty easily make curves, but if you're trying to design a piece that has tons of curves, maybe that one is better for the wheel, or maybe that's better to be coil built with a template that essentially you can put alongside of it to check in and see how you're doing along the way. If you're trying to make pieces that feel really maybe architectural, have a lot of kind of straight lines on them, or if you don't mind getting complicated in creating cups using multiple modes, you can really go back and forth, in and out, and play around with a lot of hard lines really accurately. What I tend to recommend, design your stuff on paper, right? Start by just drawing, think about its function, right? So think about how you like to hold stuff, what it's gonna hold. If I'm holding water, that's gonna feel really different than if I'm holding coffee or cocoa or teas, right? So the actual size of your cup, the thickness of the walls, that's all gonna be dictated by what you intend on drinking off of it. So this one for me is coffee. I like my coffee cups to not be actually too thin because I like them to just retain as much heat as possible. I drink an insane amount of coffee, but I love a really hot cup of coffee. So I also design a shape that tapers in, doesn't essentially allow more air to get into that cup and lose that heat. The other thing is size. I like to drink a lot of small hot cups of coffee rather than that giant cup. That's just me, but I also find that if I designed pots that I absolutely love, that's the best way for me to find success in what I make for other people as well. If I have that direct connection with it, I can be really responsive and think about, how to make it as articulate as possible, as opposed to, if I'm making a giant cup because I have a friend that loves giant cups, there's going to be a lack of a connection with the form outside of just listening to what they want and try to recreate it. So the more that you can love and want to know every square millimeter of the pot you're making, the better off you are. So with that said, we designed it on paper. After doing a design, you're going to do a scale drawing, meaning the exact size that you want your cup to be is the exact size you should make that drawing. Use a pencil, use a ruler, be as perfect as possible on that final design. As you work your way up though, I say draw, draw, draw. Once we have your template made, we're actually going to construct that cup using that template. We'll attach handles once they set up, so more at that leather hard stage. And one of the biggest factors that I'd say, no matter where you're at, don't expect it to be perfect right out of the gate, right? You make your design, you fabricate it, take that moment or many moments to refine, to observe, to alter your template afterwards, to really dial it into the best shape possible. So to start, it's just those drawing samples. I'm going to kind of run through a bunch of drawings that I've done over here, right? So some of these are hard geometric lines. I love a lot of my cups, especially when I'm on the wheel. I like cups that kind of taper in very hard and then taper out. As I always say, I like my area to hold the coffee and I like my area above it, where it just allows coffee to not spill, mainly because I talk with my hands all the time. For the sake of this project, this template, in order to be a little bit more kind of simple, I'm not gonna go with one of these forms that go in and out. Going in and out is actually not any harder, it just takes more time. Anytime we're moving from a straight line, we're changing the angle that we're gonna move. In other words, if I'm moving from wide to narrow, and then I wanna alter it and start going from narrow to wide, that just means I need a new template, right? Which again, that's not a big deal, it's not hard. It just means you're gonna make multi-part pieces, which are slightly more complicated than just a single slab mold. Again, I just draw like crazy, right? I like to get a lot of shapes out of my system. I like to think a lot about what I've been interested in. These are some that I did today, right? So some of these are a little bit more typical in kind of what I'm getting after. Some of them were almost references to these like historical objects, milk jugs. This is the one that I think we're gonna go for today. One of my goals this year was to make cups that were more absurd. So these kind of massive bottoms that would come up and literally almost just have a ball for a handle. So I thought that would be a cool one to play around with. Now, as I talked about, we are not gonna be dealing with curves during our template making process. That's something that's really easy to put in or to flush out or give a little volume in the fabrication stage. But as we're designing it, once you're happy with that shape, we do really got to think about breaking things down into straight lines, right? So I can almost just look at, where my top resides, where my bottom began, and I can think about what it would look like if I made a straight line from the top to the bottom. Same with both sides of it. So essentially, once I say, this is the shape, I love that shape, I'm gonna go for it, that's when I really wanna think and analyze scale and sizes. Make sure it's absolutely perfect. I tend to grab a ruler and go right on my initial drawings, right? And I just start to measure and see how comfortable I am, right? Sometimes it helps to do it and actually put it on the table. And if you're designing a 3-inch cup, look at 3 inches off the table and say, is that really, what I was hoping to get at? Or does it feel like it needs to be modified even before I start to draw? So once I'm at that stage, we're just gonna make a really simple drawing. I'm gonna get an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper and as accurately as possible to scale, meaning 1-to-1. If this is a 5-inch tall cup, I'm gonna draw it 5 inches tall. If it's 4 inches wide, I'm gonna draw it 4 inches wide. I want it to be as precise as humanly possible. And the reason being, we're literally gonna use this drawing to formulate or fabricate our template. So for me, again, that straight line across the bottom, just so that we have kind of our base to build off of. I like getting my center line in the middle just so I can have symmetry. We are gonna be making symmetrical cups through this method. And then I just started off with my measurements. I actually played around just to see if I was gonna like it or what it would look like if it was a little taller. And I could tell I hated it immediately. But essentially what I have is about 3 inches at the very top, about 3.5 inches in height, and a 6-inch width. So that's an incredibly wide bottom. But again, for me, I wanted to make these really absurd shapes. From there, once I feel good about it and feel good about those curves, right, I'm just gonna break this down into straight lines. Because again, the curves don't come into play in that template. So I'm gonna start with where it terminates at the top and just draw my straight line to where it terminates on the bottom. I'm gonna do the same for both sides. Again, I always love drawing in the curves because I want to know that I'm going to be able to get there, but it doesn't mean that I need to essentially only make straight walled pieces. Curves are really simple with slabs too, as long as you can have the right mentality behind it. All right, so that's what that is going to look like. From here, we're going to cut this out and start translating it into a larger form so that it can get placed on clay. Again, just as precise as possible. I'm going to cut out this shape. And then I'm going to get a large sheet of paper ready so that I can actually translate this form onto it directly. Now, when I used to teach this, we used to involve a lot of math. We used a lot of pi, circumference. And for some students, they absolutely loved it. If you're a mathematician, it's so cool to be able to kind of think and calculate and literally, turn this idea into a form through that power. But what I found is that for a lot of artists, myself including, it can actually be really limiting to think on my feet. So this method actually works almost as well. It's dramatically faster. And I just love kind of how simple and straightforward it is. So what I call this is the 3 times method. We took this original template that we made and we're actually just going to repeat it 3 times. Again, as I mentioned, we were talking about pi. Pi still comes into play, and comes into play when I talk about that 3 times method, right? So the reason that we're going to repeat this template 3 times, one after another, is because pi is 3.14. In other words, when we're trying to find the circumference of a circular object, we're going to take its diameter and multiply that by 3.14 times. That should be the length of our line. A much, much simpler way to go about it is I'm just going to trace this template, flipping it over each time. And as I do that, we will get very close to our 3.14. Again, this is all going to be very geometric lines. So 1, to flip it, really keep that edge right at that same spot and just rotate it over. Okay, take your time kind of lining it back up. And get onto that next tracing. Right, one more time. Right, so there we have it. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. 1, 2, 3. Now these are obviously very hard lines that we've created, right? These kind of straight walls, and that's not what we want. What we're thinking about is cylinders, circles, curving forms. I could go ahead and use a compass. Sometimes that's great. As an artist, I just like to eye it up. Again, I just find the more that I jump right into things, I trust my hand, I trust my eye, the more fluid it is and the faster it is. So what I'm gonna really think about though, is making sure that I hit all those major points. And by major points, I mean all the actual corners of that template. So our heights, those are really important. And the same with the bases, right? Like where it's gonna start from the bottom and where it starts on the top. From there, all I'm doing is almost playing a little connect the dots, right? So I could almost look at this as being a series of 8 points, right? And I wanna just connect my dots via a curve, right? So I wanna have a smooth, fluid curve that connects all of these dots in a line on both sides. this is gonna be a pretty big template, especially for that bottom, because this is an absurdly wide cup. So don't expect when you go to make it that might be your same experience. Again, we want to essentially make sure we have fluid curves, right, on both inner wall and outer wall. That next thing that you can do while you still have your template, right, is just essentially trace the bottom. Mark off where your center is. And do that in multiple directions, right? Our bottom is going to be a circle. So that, again, we could almost do in that same type of way. As long as we have our center line, we line up our center line. We can essentially just create a series of points. Again, we could use a variety of different drawing tools just to help get our precision. Sometimes for the bottom too, I say just look around the studio and see if you have anything that's really close to that in terms of being that size of a circle. I could hand draw that, I could trace that one. Whatever the case is, you want to keep your original template and you want to make sure you make a bottom with this template, because if your bottoms came off the same actual origins as your sidewalls, they're always going to be accurate. From here, we're going to cut these forms out and see how we did. So here we have it. The one thing I want to note, right, is right now I'm doing this on paper. There's a couple of different materials you can use to actually make your templates. Roofing paper, tar paper, that's really common, right, because it's designed to take on water. It's thicker. I don't know, it's cool stuff. I tend to not repeat a lot. I go in smaller series. I do have tar paper, but kind of very, very rarely use it. What I do more often than not, if I want to kind of use a template for a while, is I essentially just do a cheap lamination where I cover it in packing tape, use an X-Acto knife just to trim it down. And that will just stop that moisture from kind of getting all over it. Just be aware, if you don't do that, right, and you're leaving this on your clay for almost even short periods of time, it will start to take on a little bit of water. And the downside of that is that it's going to start to be a little wrinkly and wavy, and it's just not going to give you that same precision that you initially designed for. So, you know, that would be my only thing where I'd say you're definitely not forced to coat it with anything. And again, I'm kind of weird environmentally where I absolutely hate coating materials in any form of a plastic, which may be the reason I should be using that roofing paper more often, but I don't know. You know, I'm also drawn to that immediacy of the solution. There we go, almost done, almost set. This is gonna also fall in line with that old woodworker's expression, measure twice, cut once, right? Once I kind of feel like I nailed my templates, stand them up, right? They should correlate. So I should be able to essentially put that template right down on my paper and say, you know, how does it look like it's lining up? Does it look like my bottom is appropriate? And does it look like it's making it all the way around? For me, that's kind of good enough for me to jump in and do that test. So we'll see, maybe I'll do a quick coating on that one, toss out a couple of slabs super fast and just see what it can turn into. So here we're gonna wrap this up. When I made my slabs, I tossed them back and forth on the table. I also opted to use a wiggle wire just to give my slabs a little bit more like, you know, funk, pizzazz, awesomeness, whatever you want to call it. It also kind of highlights that idea of like, why would we use slab building techniques? What can we do with slabs that would be really difficult to do in another building method? So I used that wiggle wire, I stretched it out so I have these kind of nice, beautiful curving lines. It fits exactly. I got a template or a slab for both my walls and my circle or my bottom. So to start off, I'm literally just gonna cut them out using straight lines, right? So I just wanna get rid of any excess clay. One of my things that I always swear by is using a relatively sharp knife to make my cuts. When I go to the edge, I tend to just cut down. I hate using pin tools, at least for that. Again, I just want to cut the clay. I don't want to drag the clay. So here we go. Right, again, straight lines. I'm going to remove all of my excess. And I'm going to do the same here. So I got my bottom. Now, one little trick, and if you don't have it, no worries, you can always just kind of eye it up. Clay is amazing in the sense of you being able to manipulate it or stretch it or not nail angles, but you can kind of work them into shape. But if you have one, or if you're really interested in this technique, I highly recommend acquiring one. Get one of these kind of angle cutters. A bunch of companies make them. This is just a really cheap one off of Amazon. And the way that I'm gonna think about it, right, is that I like to have essentially all of my walls sync up or match together perfectly, right? So when it comes down to these angles on the sides, if I was cutting it by hand, what I tend to think of is whatever angle I cut on one side, I want to do the same on this. Just to not confuse things, I'm going to stay away from the angle cutter. I'm also going to assume that you don't have one, but I will show you how it works when it comes to that bottom piece. Again, so I'm going to keep a blade, I'm going to turn it to its side, I'm going to cut it at a 45. Again, just ballpark, right? My knife stays in that same position. I'm going to come to the other side to it and do that same technique. Now my bottom, right? Remember this form is actually starting wide and tapering in. So my bottom is gonna have a 45-degree angle cut as well. Again, just ballpark. Just remove all that excess. All right, just for the sake of demonstration and because I talked about it. Now I essentially on this one have the option to say I can have my wiggles right on the interior or I could have them on the exterior. I'm gonna go for the interior on this one just because again, I find it to be pretty curious, right? When you start to like embed patterns inside of forms. All right, so from here, this comes down to spraying, scoring, and standing up. So I love using my little scoring tools that I have. It's my handy dandy tool belt there. I don't use a lot of tools in my studio at all, but I do love these ones. So again, this is really soft clay. So I'm just gonna go around, I'll make all my score marks on this exterior. This bottom is probably a little thicker than I would typically do. It looks even thicker because I had to cut it at a 45. But again, as I was talking about making really absurd forms and pieces, having a bottom that's just a little oversized in thickness doesn't feel inappropriate, put it that way. All right, so I'm just gonna get all my scores done in multiple directions. In other words, I always like to cross hatch. Don't cheap out on your scoring. That's one thing that I feel like I've learned over the years. All right, next thing I'm gonna do is spritz. I don't like to use slurry, I always use water. My kind of mentality around it is that if I'm using a lot of slurry when I go to make my connections, essentially it would mean that we have this liquid clay that's solidified, and that's going to be kind of in between our multiple parts. What I much prefer to do is to get slurry to develop on the clay surface and then really work it in. Essentially, the only downside to just having slurry and having it just stay there is that it's not compressed, not nearly the same way that the rest of the clay is. So it is going to create a weak spot. And there are moments where I still use that, especially if I'm making like square boxes that I want to be perfect. So this is home stretch. Really, at this stage, I'm gonna gently pick this form up. Again, for me, I'm gonna rotate it. I'm gonna set that up on that lip. And really just like work that clay around. If I'm off at all, right? If I feel like it's not perfect, I don't want to just fudge anything into shape. I want to essentially peel it back, fix it, move forward, right? So our seam essentially should match up pretty perfectly, right? If we're correct on our distances. And the other thing just to be very, very aware of, right, is this clay is very wet. So with my seams here, it's a nice kind of matchup, but I really am gonna wait to perfect everything, right? So I just wanna make sure that I have nice, solid connections as I go around. If need be, I can take a circular form and just kind of pop it in just to make sure I have that perfect circle up on the top if that's what I care about, right? And then this piece in particular, there was going to be more volume to it, right? So I'm going to get rid of those straight lines that we have just by kind of bellying it out just the tiniest little bit. Sometimes I wait to do this. On this one, I want to give it just a tiny bit before it gets wrapped up. But essentially from here, right, I want to just wrap this up a hair, give it some time to set up and develop, then really refine every area, clean up those seams, clean up those bottoms, especially on the insides. Think about that handle. On this one, it'll probably just be a big giant ball. But they're really delicate, right? We just essentially grew about 4 inches of height within a matter of seconds. It's gonna need time to set up. It's a really loose, very, very thin cut form right now. But that's it, right? So there's your demonstration on that Slab Built Cup. This is a pretty basic one, but I can't wait to see what you do. All right, thanks y'all. All right, everybody, here's where I stand. This cup has just sat wrapped in plastic for about 2 days. Would have been the next day if I had time. But essentially, I'm gonna unwrap it right now, kind of figure out what state it's in, and then just bring this cup to completion. All right, so this is definitely not leather hard yet. It's at a pretty good working state though, right? So it's still super thin. I'm gonna essentially start off by flipping it over, really rework all those seams. I am gonna use just a small little wooden tool to really firm up those seams on the interior and those areas that I can't get to. I'll probably try to smooth over these exterior seams with a sponge. Add a handle and add some feet to it. It's gonna be a lot of playing. You'll notice though at this point, right, this piece is stiff enough where I can hold it like this, right? So it's still nice and wet, but it is far from being really at that leather hard stage. So I can still modify it, I can still change it, I can really work those seams, but I don't have that incredibly soft clay anymore that can just be a little challenging on those walls. I'll probably spend maybe 15 to 20 minutes trying to work it out with additional time to make the handles and the feet and all those other attachments. Here we go, wish me luck. All right, my friends, so I'm wrapping it up, calling it on this one. Last thing I have to do is just put my signature on it and get it ready for the kiln. But essentially, that's it. I always want to make sure pieces like this dry relatively slow. Be aware if you're putting feet like that, there's a lot of tension as it goes to shrink in. So putting it on a little sheet of plastic actually goes a real long way. But I'm feeling pretty great about this piece. It's definitely absurd, funky. Has some really cool textures, some cool pattern marks. One thing I'm going to learn a ton about it is when I actually go to use it, right? So when I actually go to handle it and hold it after this has shrunk and come out of the kiln, maybe I'll feel really differently about it. Maybe I'll love it. Maybe I'll modify my original template, or maybe I'll kind of add some more templates to build off the top. But there you have it, your basics on forming cups using templates and using slabs. I hope you have a blast, and I can't wait to see what you make. All right, peace and love, everybody.